Hello, my curious cats, and welcome to episode 7 of the Say Psychology podcast, the podcast for all the info on psychology's most questionable history. I'm your host, Leslie Lopez, PhD student and psychology nerd. Okay, if you're watching this on YouTube, then you already know, but if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, then I invite you over to the YouTube machine and check out the podcast at the Say Psychology podcast, where you can watch me talk to myself for 15 to 20 minutes. So, hope to see you there. Okay, listen, are you ever just like driving and your mind just like wanders somewhere else? I mean, that happens to me all the time. It's not a good thing, but like, it happens. It happens to all of us. So I was just like driving the other day and I was thinking like, oh my God, it's already April. Like, that's insane. Can the clock stop for a little bit for a second there, right? And like this thought comes to me a lot every year, especially around the month of April, because April is my birthday month. Yes, I'm a Taurus. So it's just, I get to think, like, oh my God, I'm another year closer to 30. Not yet, but another year closer. And I am nowhere near close to getting my life together. It will probably never happen, but like, it's just the thought that comes to mind. If anything, I'm turning 28, and if anything I'm grateful for, it's that I was not invited to join the 27 club. And if you know, then it's not it's the one thing that I could be grateful for, if anything. But, I'm thinking, just like, I'm just sitting there thinking. I was at a stoplight, and then I noticed that the Dairy Queen was giving out free ice cream. So I was like, hey, let me scoot down there and get a free ice cream cone. I think it was like something about spring or something. But free ice cream, I wasn't going to say no to that. So I scoot on over to the Dairy Queen drive-thru, get my free ice cream. And fun fact about me, actually, is I am lactose intolerant. And I got so excited with my free ice cream that I forgot to take my Lactaid. Not sponsored, but I forgot to take it. And next thing I know, I was on my phone Googling how to cure stomach issues for a 27-year-old woman. And that, my curious cats, is how I got to today's episode. Today's episode is on Emma Eckstein, a 27-year-old woman who initially just needed a cure for her stomach pain, found herself being one of Sigmund Freud's most famous patients. So, if you're a little bit insane in the membrane like me, get cozy-tozy and let's jump into it. Our girl today is Emma Eckstein, born in Vienna, Austria on January 28, 1865. An Aquarius. We love Aquarius women over here. Shout out to my girl Megan. Growing up, Emma's family was fairly close to the very famous psychologist Sigmund Freud. In fact, one of Emma's brothers, Frederick, was referred to as a friend of mine by Freud himself in his book Civilization and Discontents, published in 1930. Not much is known on Emma's early life aside from the fact that she came from a very socialist family and she herself was very active in the Viennese women's movement, a group of women actively seeking out greater rights and opportunities for women in higher academia. And honestly, love that for her because, like I said, this was the 1800s and women were barely allowed to walk outside, let alone demand better rights and a better life. So, when Girly Pop was 27, she paid a visit to one Mr. Sigmund Freud. She was there with concerns of severe stomach cramps, mood swings, and depression, particularly around the time she was menstruating. Again, remember, this was the 1800s. Women's health was practically non-existent back then. After a few sessions with Dr. Freud doing his psychoanalysis on poor PMS Emma, Freud diagnosed Emma with none other than suffering from hysteria, get this, due to excess masturbation. Yes, you heard that right. Emma DJ'd too much, therefore that made her Nalulu. Now, DJing was considered dangerous to a woman's mental health back then. Of course it was. In fact, actually, ask any Joe Rogan, Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson fan out there and they'll probably still tell you it is. Listen, this was the early 1800s, okay? There was only so much that doctors could go off of when it came to women's health and the female mind. I'm telling you, if anything, it could have been so much worse for her, and somehow it did get so much worse. When Freud decided to ultimately take on Emma's case, she really gave him a lot to work with. 3 years worth, actually. Today, we're going to be focusing on Emma's case specifically because if I were to do a deep dive into the history of Freud, I would have to be making an entire series on him because, as you could imagine, there's so much to unpack there to fit into just one single episode. Alright, back to Emma. So, Freud was quick to diagnose Emma with trauma related to sexual abuse in her early life. This information, however, is to be taken with a grain of salt because if there's one thing that Freud is known for is imposing false memories into his patients. Memories that just so happen to fit into his Oedipal complex theory, so keep that in mind. Okay, in the span of a few sessions, Emma would confess to Freud that on 2 different occasions, when she was 8 years old, she was sexually assaulted by the owner of a neighborhood candy shop when she would go and buy candy. The thing that fascinated Freud about this memory is that after the first candy shop incident, Emma claims to have understood that what had just happened was wrong. Nonetheless, she went back a second time. Now, when Freud heard this, it was like he himself was a child in a candy shop. It's said that Emma was more than happy to share her experience with Freud, whether she's like me and loved the process of analysis, or she's also like me and her tummy ache was seriously killing her. Through Emma, Freud was able to confirm some theories that he had already coined from past patients, but none whom were as cooperative as Emma. For example, Emma believed that much of her masturbation problem stemmed from what she referred to as a bad conscience that she developed the second she decided to go back to the candy shop for a second time. When Freud heard what Emma was saying, he quickly attributed this to his wish theory. Essentially, his wish theory describes that our dreams to be underlying messages through an involuntary thought process that tells us our true desires and how to satisfy them. These desires and their satisfactions are typically indirect and require a deeper psychoanalysis to really interpret their true meaning. The fact that Emma had not shared this information with anyone else, despite being a pretty open book, gave way to Freud's deferred action theory. Deferred action theory suggests that we have a mode of retroactive attribution of sexual or traumatic experiences from our past. In other words, we engage in self-regulatory behaviors in order to avoid the negative emotions of a traumatic experience. In Emma's case, the traumatic yet repressed experience was being SA'd by the candy shop owner, and the self-regulatory behavior, or deferred action, if you will, was her constant masturbation. Is this making any sense? I know Freud is a lot to take in, so just bear with me, because believe me, Freud is the least of Emma's problems. And on that note, let's all give a warm welcome to our new friend, Dr. William Flies. Dr. William Flies was a successful and well-respected ear, nose, and throat surgeon who also happened to be a very good friend of our old friend, Dr. Sigmund Freud. You see, Dr. Flies was an interesting physician, that's for sure. His medical interests range from biorhythms to bisexuality to topical cocaine. Like, this man was all over the place. His specialty, however, was in the ear, nose, and mouth area. He truly believed that the nose specifically wasn't given the credit it deserved. Back in the late 1800s, Dr. Flies had developed a theory that someone's sexual problems were linked to the nose through some kind of nasogenital connection. That's naso as in nose and genital as in your private parts. His solution to a person's nasal reflex neurosis was to cauterize the inside of the person's nose with nothing but some surgical tools and some local anesthesia. If you're as much as a curious cat like me, you're probably wondering how on earth a person would even come up with this conclusion. First of all, Dr. Fly's theory is considered a complete pseudoscience today. Let's start there, okay? There is absolutely zero scientific evidence that a nasogenital connection even exists. Second of all, Flies was a man much like Freud. Much of his practices were derived off like ideas and hunches, except as a surgeon, Flies tried to physically cure his patients while Freud was obviously more of a mental healer. Okay, back to our girl Emma. Y'all remember her? Okay, well, remember how she had that little touching herself too much problem? Well, aside from wanting to cure her from her traumas, Freud had the wonderful idea to send her over to his great friend Dr. William Flies to try and cure her of her physical issues as well. Since Freud was a big fan of Flies' nasogenital theory, course he was. He believed that paired with his psychoanalysis, it could be a cure-all for Emma's issues. So, on February of 1895, Dr. Flies operated on Emma's nose to try and rid of that nasogenital connection we were talking about earlier. That supposedly played a big part in her constant touching herself behavior. My poor girl Emma, she was only 27. She should have been at the club, man. But Emma's surgery was a complete disaster, as you would have imagined. Dr. Flies, who was backed up by Dr. Freud, it went nothing like he had planned, okay? She suffered from terrible infections, including profuse bleeding, and Dr. Fly's procedure wasn't even done in a correct or delicate manner because he had accidentally, quote, accidentally, left this like giant wad of surgical gauze lodged inside her nasal cavity. Like he just forgot to remove it after the surgery. It was so bad that Freud himself had to call in another nose specialist to remove the gauze that our friend Dr. Flies just forgot about. Emma's entire nose was so damaged that she was left permanently disfigured. I'm sorry, if she wasn't traumatized enough already, I can only imagine the horrors she would have been feeling at this point, okay? Oh, but it does get worse. Imagine. Freud, his love for his friend Dr. Flies was greater than his patient's care. Yeah, at first when he saw Emma's face, he was obviously pissed because he was expecting a cure-all from his surgical friend over here. But as the days passed, he not only gaslit himself, but he gaslit Emma into thinking that the damage was all her fault. You heard that right. In an effort to comfort Dr. Flies and save their reputations, Freud reiterated the damage to Emma's face as a result to her initial nasal symptoms, which were due to her hysteria, aka her constant masturbation. In other words, had she not been constantly touching herself, they would not have resorted to such drastic measures that led to her disfigured face. So obviously, it's all her fault. Freud called this phenomenon wish bleeding. So fast forward a couple of years, I guess the gaslighting worked because 2 years after her disastrous nose job, Emma joined forces with Freud and became the first woman analyst in 1897. As a psychoanalyst working alongside Freud, she specialized in the area of sexual and social hygiene. She theorized that daydreams were these like parasitic plants that invaded the life of young girls everywhere. I guess she was so traumatized by the damage that was caused due to her lack of self-control that she wouldn't have wished it on anyone else. Well, in 1904, Emma published a book on the sexual education of children. It did fairly well back then, however, she does not mention Freud in it at all. That's such an Aquarius move, honestly. Love that for her. Emma lived a fairly short life, however. She had surgery in 1910. It's not sure if it was in any way related to her previous botched surgery with Dr. Flies, but sadly, this surgery did not go so well either. She practically became bedridden and died of a stroke in 1924 due to complications of this last surgery. And she was only 59. Something I have to keep reminding myself when reading upon cases like this is that all of this happened in the 1800s. Medicine and psychology were nowhere near where they are and what they are today. Today, Emma's issues, the cramps, the DJing, could be attributed to PMS and ovulation, respectively. As for Dr. Fly's nasogenital theory, although it's officially classified as a pseudoscience, there is some validity as to why he would come up with such a crazy idea, believe it or not. Our olfactory senses are a very powerful stimulant. The olfaction is the most basic of all the senses and has a strong connection to our brain's limbic system. The limbic system is a formation of brain structures that is located right in between the thalamus, the cerebral cortex, and the top of the brainstem. Its major function is associated with controlling our emotions and our behavioral responses to our emotions. It's why smells have such a powerful trigger to old memories. It's also a major influence on the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system, two systems that are directly involved in the act of sexual arousal. So, in a way, he wasn't too far off. His approach was just a little off, to say the least. Well, my curious cats, thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. If there's one thing I'm thankful for, is for sure a slight advancement in women's health. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, review, and share with other curious cats. Please leave your thoughts and comments on today's episode, and please leave any suggestions on future episodes. I want to know what y'all want to know. Over on my Twitter, at Tips with Trent, I left an episode suggestion on Bryce Hall, Alabama's historic insane asylum, opened in 1860 and in 2010 was turned into a performing arts center with quite the history to it. Honestly, sounds really interesting because I currently live in Seattle and we have quite the history on mental asylums here, and I am super intrigued by all of it, so I'll definitely have to check out what's going down in Alabama. To stay up to date with news and episodes, check out the podcast Instagram page at the Say Psychology Podcast. And as always, citations will be in the description if you want to check those out. Stay blessed, stay sane, and stay psyched. I love you. Bye.